I dated a girl who worked in a homeless, like a place where they let homeless people just get off the street and go
Yeah.
do art and whatever.
Yeah.
And it was just like just mayhem, like constant jacking off and like Tammy, my penis hurt. My penis hurt. I have to go boom boom. Come everywhere and dicks in the bathroom. Anywhere you turn, there's a fucking cock hanging out.
Yeah.
Me tell me, oh my penis go boom boom. I'm not joking. The art that art has more merit and more value than this, and I'm serious. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. This is the worst stuff that humanity, as far as creative, but this as far as stuff that's creative and not destructive. This is the very worst that you can do. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything worse than this. I really mean that.
Sam Hyde is, of course, a man who needs no explanation, but I'll tell you, at least me personally, I've always taken his serious advice clips very seriously. And I think that he is one of the most genuine voices out there for life advice and creativity advice. Personally, it's been my goal for some time to be a manga artist, essentially. And I've done, just like with anything else in life, I've done all the steps I think I need to do it. And it's something that, generally I don't feel I have accomplished much because it's a difficult goal. But it's something that, at least in my mind, goes without saying that I need to take seriously. And sometimes I forget, sometimes one thing that could be encouraging when I'm feeling discouraged, frankly, is the realization of how little most people try, to be perfectly honest. Particularly, I think the problem is consumerism, which is practically like the meaning of willful slavery in this society. When I talk to some of my friends at work that are, some which, get paid much more than me and stuff, the thing I notice though is that like their after work stuff, what they say they're gonna do, it's just always video games, always I'm gonna drink, I'm gonna piss myself, something like that. And frankly, it is interesting how people are accepting of those expectations. For me personally, one thing I've realized about myself is I cannot stand the idea of just being some consumer who, spends his time on Discord, something like that. I used to sort of be, and even then, I just hadn't really awakened to the fact that that wasn't really what I wanted. And I guess long-windedly, my point is, I really, really related to this clip of Sam Hyde and really believe his genuineness as a creator and a productive person in life because of his complaining about a clip like this. You are not a true creative person if you don't complain. And while I don't personally have a gripe with like the Star Wars stuff, I feel like that's probably because he's a millennial and he was surrounded by those douchebags. I absolutely can relate to certain things in anime and gaming and things that I do that I cannot stand, that I have absolutely the same thoughts on. I'm thinking that they're worthless and that they're encouraged by assholes. And yeah, for the record, that Star Wars movie, which is called To the Death by Corridor Digital, it really is fucking horrible. I mean, like, literally everything about it. I admit, I had been in film classes in a college at one point in my life. That was, like, exactly the kind of video they would have shown us, in, like, a video editing class. But, like, the whole thing of, like, oh my god, like, the guy who runs the school is, like, this dude with a cap and hipster looking guy, and the student is like this half hippie looking guy. It's just everything about it is just fan service of Star Wars in the wrong way possible. It's awful. But when it comes to any art you don't like, the truth is, it is as serious as politics. It is as serious in the mind of anyone as anything that's so-called real life. I think what's his name? James Joyce once said like life mimics art much more than art mimics life. I mean, that's something that I think is very clearly true. Because, art is where you have your ego-based passions and everything, and that's the whole point of life, is to chase those. And art is often about themes and your ideals and things like that. It absolutely is something political and religious, whether you like it or not. One pretty gut-wrenching, maybe in some people's minds, thing that Sam Hyde said a lot back in 2023 when there were all those clips of him, and probably the same with that Sam Hyde show that he's doing like weekly now. Great show, by the way. I especially liked his episode about boomers. But he says it's too late when you're 30. And I think when he says that, it's not about being literal necessarily, but frankly, that's something that I kind of feel like I've seen in my life a lot, both online and on the internet. I mean, like, for example, I mean, I think maybe a better message, more specifically, is that nobody's going to tell you to take the right path in life and do what you want. In fact, I would say if you go along with what normal society standards are saying, you're probably going to just be led on the worst path. And I do feel like, while you are younger, you'll get more of a chance to mess up. For example, like if you try out something that you don't end up liking, which is kind of what my manga was about, my most recent one. But anyway, but my point is, like, I do feel like if you're in, like, your late 20s and you haven't come to some decision on something you want to do, I think that really can lead to spiritual ruin very quickly. And I do feel like, frankly, I have seen that a lot. And sometimes you'll even see people, and I really do feel like that's pretty much like the worst punishment I can think of in life, is to spend your whole life locked in a situation where you're not in that, where you're not doing what you want, where somebody might pity you or something. But getting into things like art, like everything else, I have noticed within those realms there are pitfalls. Thankfully, I've never gotten too attached to social media and don't use it too much. But like I've noticed, like, for example, the whole like art scene, anime art scene, is just. I mean, I don't even necessarily feel conflicted by it, but I just feel like it's very silly. I feel like you see a lot of people who are more interested in wanting to call themselves artists than to put out a good product, or some people's standard idea is making some one image so that they can retweet it and cover it a bunch of new retweets. Personally, I just think it's more important to, part of the reason a lot of people don't do manga, I think, is because, it's harder. And I'm not saying that just because it's harder, that means it's better. In fact, things like lighting and coloring are things that personally I've only just recently delved into. So I'm certainly not claiming to be able to do some of those, color complete pieces that people post on there. But I'm just saying, that's not because, I'm avoiding anything. It's because it's simply not my priority, and I would rather, have a specific priority. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that social media attention doesn't matter. One thing Sam Hyde said as well that I thought was a good point was basically, like, there are some people out there who say, like, oh, no one understands me, that's why I have no following. But, like, no, it's true. Like, if you don't have any following, that probably does just mean you're a failure. I completely agree. Like, I have pretty much no following in manga, and I don't see why I would even bother denying that I am not successful. But I noticed already that some people, like some of the people I found in like the American manga world, which is a pretty small community to begin with, is like, yeah, for one thing, they're interested, like the only thing you can do like professionally in America is like win these contests, these like one-shot contests. And they're always telling you to like make one-shots. I don't know why. I think one-shots are pretty much always really fucking boring. I would rather just make a failure of a long series. And I basically have made two short series that were both pretty much failures, or well, discontinuations. And I don't regret them, and I am glad because I learned a lot from them, and I did a lot more than I probably would from a one shot, and I did not get much attention from it either. I never even thought of entering in some gay contest so I could get some gas money. I feel like when people get too into certain subcultures and feel like they're being accepted by certain groups, their priority becomes this feeling of being accepted or feeling like they're living up to some sort of label of like, oh, I'm this artist or I'm this, instead of focus on the actual material. And I think that's, when I was younger, I would make that sort of mistake too in some things, but it's just, I think it is silly to fall into that, and I think at the end of the day, it's just another thing you might regret. I mean, one funny thing about art, is that one thing Sam Hyde said that was interesting once, that was actually a really good point, was basically like anyone can draw. And you gotta realize that, like, if you feel you can draw, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter without some specific goal. And look at how many people on social media, look at the whole blue sky scene and everything. There's a lot of amateur artists on there. There's almost like this encouragement of amateur artists. Sam Hyde was recently saying, I think in the latest Sam Hyde show episode, I think it was one called Education Sucks. He made a good point about AI artwork, how everybody knows that AI artwork is pretty much slop. But the thing is, it's really just kind of a continuation of what's been encouraged since like 2015 in particular. You see so much encouragement of, not really trying in art and in music or whatever. And, you get this thing where they say like, oh, well, yeah, but it's still fine. Oh, yeah, but it still works. But at the end of the day, you're just selling yourself short with this whole thing of like this self-acceptance of this thing of not wanting to really improve. And I'm not trying to do the whole whiplash angle thing or anything. I think that movie is really just kind of childish, and that movie was actually, by the way, partially the inspiration or part of what I was trying to sort of look into thematically when it comes to my recent discontinued manga, Total Onslaught. But my point is, I'm not saying I don't think there's anything wrong with having an ego when it comes to art or anything, but I think that you're not really going to satisfy yourself if you see these kind of small bits of success that just aren't going to last in you. But, I really had kind of an interesting culture shock recently. Or, well, I mean, maybe that's not the word. Maybe I was just too into my own thing. But relating to what I was saying about people having lower standards or bad ideals, I went to an anime convention, and it was kind of interesting how there were people there. Quite a few people at the art stands were actually saying that they were able to make a living off of what they were doing. Sometimes when someone says that, that's a little bit of a generalization, like maybe they're partially living off someone else, but like it did sound like people were making a surprising amount of money, especially considering that like all the artists there pretty much were not that great. Some of them were straight up like bad. None of the artists were like the kind of artists that you would see propped up, on social media or anything. And a lot of them had like almost no following, and yet they were still able to make a good small business out of it. Which I suppose in some ways was encouraging, but at the same time was like, had that feeling for me of like, is this really your highest standard? And I realized this more like as somebody who had been working hard at art and everything, I remember I came to that same convention the year before, and it was when I was just getting started. And I remember there was like little art activities there, like art jam and stuff, and I remember I felt really bad because I knew such little about art at that time that I was not able to do shit even when it came to like playing around. And this convention, I had a small goal. I just was like, I want to be able to make sure I can just draw something of interest. And technically I did achieve that goal. There was even one person who asked me to draw them in a simplistic way, and I had really been, particularly the month before, I had really been delving into figure drawing and anatomy. But I've deliberately taken a break from making manga for the sake of studying, art theory and everything, and it's been pretty fun. But my point is like, it's my artwork was not that great necessarily, but I realized like in like those art jam spaces and stuff, people just like, I was kind of surprised of how little anyone cared. It was just like, oh, you're a good artist, you're a bad artist, doesn't matter. And like, of course that is the case with most people. And of course, like, it's my job to be a little more hyper focused on that. But it's interesting how, like, again, it seemed like people's standards and passions just weren't in the creative spot. And I guess I just found that kind of disappointing. In some cases, it does make me feel a little bit better because it does make me feel like it's a little less difficult to compete, I suppose. But I guess, I did really feel that there. Like, I remember there was a friend of mine there who I had met the year before, and he did like some pretty simplistic anime art stuff. But he definitely, like, knew more than me and stuff like that. And I do remember like last year feeling like kind of an idiot, like, oh, I didn't even show him any of my art or anything. And I remember I came up to him the next year and I was like, hey, I've been studying figure drawing, I've been doing this. And he was just like, oh, okay, cool. And like, but like, he said it in like the sense of like, I don't really care, just do what you want. And, he had his own thing of drawing simplistic stuff. But my point is like, it is kind of funny. It's like, I guess I've just explained it already, but it's I consider it a good trait in me that I stress over this stuff when most people don't. I'm not saying that automatically makes me better. I'm just saying, I do. It seems to me like almost instinctual to, I guess, always want to improve, to look back at my older work and say that I could have easily done better there, stuff like that. And it's I think that's something that's pretty obviously important. I remember, but on the topic of MDE, I do remember at that event, there was a group of people I met, and they were good people and all, but so it was like a group of a bunch of people from Chicago who were like very party-esque, and it turned out they were all big fans of Fish Tank. And I had this kind of theory. I had this kind of theory for a while, which is basically like, I feel like Fish Tank is like the Goy Slop of MDE. Like, if you're only a fan of Fish Tank, you're like the lowest tier wisdom. I mean, like, I just don't take kindly to anything relating to reality TV. I'm just not a fan of the concept, even if it's Sam Hyde or whatever. I never really understood what people like about that show. But my point is, like, these people knew it seemed like all of them were, like, big fans of Fish Tank. But, like, none of them knew about, like, World Peace, Extreme Peace, like, anything involving, like, Sam Hyde's, like, life advice clips. They brought a lot of alcohol. They, like, they were party people. It was, like, the exact opposite of, like, what Sam Hyde would tell somebody to do in their serious clips. I just thought that was kind of interesting. Like, I would have thought Sam Hyde fans were all like, like me. Of course they're not. And I'm sure Sam Hyde knows they're not. But that is the truth. That's always going to be, I think, the majority of people. I'm not trying to insult those people. But like, I remember I did try to participate in their like party culture for one night. I remember the only real reason I did, to be honest, was because there was one girl there who I thought was like interested in me. It turned out she was just like nice to everyone. I think she was the one who asked me to draw a picture of her, but but it ended with me basically just coming across as really awkward, and I think that's mostly just because I'm not really into the party stuff. Like, I remember, like, these people were like my age. They had like a hotel room that was really messy. They had like an open bag of Cheetos that was tasteless because they had left it the whole night. And they were joking about how they were all broke, or most of them were. And I'm like, you guys still brought the alcohol. You guys still traveled here. Like, it just seemed to me like stuff. I don't mean to sound like I'm better than other people or anything. I'm just saying, like, it did kind of surprise me. It's like, is this like, you're okay with this being your lifestyle and everything? But again, I suppose I do just take it as a good omen at the end of the day. I forget what that line is in the Bible, but don't they say that, like, most people don't make it to heaven or something? I think it's very clear right there when you see that that's the case. Majority is always wrong.
I knew I was going to have a hard path through life. RISD job fair for animation, film animation, video, and they had all these guys come from like AAA game studios and toy companies and stuff, like recruiters basically, to look at portfolios. And there was this one girl who did and they didn't like my stuff at all, and my stuff was good. And there was one girl who did like a martial arts karate demonstration type thing as her animation, and a guy from some company that had no business being like a big company, he was like, I like it, but I'm thinking, what if he comes out and just has this like Zen moment and bows before doing his demonstration, just to show his centeredness.
Wait, he said that?
Yeah.
You know, this is something that I can all too well relate to, like, already. I mean, here's the thing. I'm not saying my shit is that good thus far, but in terms of, like, people rejecting my work and laughing it off, and then saying somebody else's shit work is better, I can completely relate to that. Like, there was this thing, I was once dumb enough to join a Discord server of this person. I won't say who it was, but there was someone on YouTube who was into manga who had made a large quantity of stuff. She wasn't necessarily that successful, I wouldn't say, but she was definitely did some stuff that was not easy to do, I would say. She did definitely have a bit of an ego on her, but like one thing I noticed is that like she was very big on like I'm a teacher. I know how to give people advice. I'm the advice guy. And her work really wasn't that interesting to me, but I did think that she made some good content on YouTube of teaching how to do certain stuff. She but then like I remember what happened was like I remember she had this small Discord server. There were like 2 other people who were like kind of talking to her like she was this teacher that she seemed to think of herself as. And like I remember these people, they were like very much following these almost like college like guidelines, like, hey, I'm writing a script the way you taught me, I'm writing this gay little script. And I had like already, you know, written I remember like they were showing her like pieces of stuff and she kept like, you know, giving them pieces of mental candy, like, oh, you're doing great. And I remember at the time specifically thinking, you know what, I could do that, but I'm going to deliberately not show much of what I'm doing until I've completed this chapter, and I did. And I come out with chapter 3 of Total Onslaught, and the chapter, so first of all, like she criticized some things, first of all, that definitely deserve to be criticized. Like, for example, if you read it, that 3rd chapter in particular was, you know, too much dialogue, which is a common problem. It's not too easy to, well, I mean, there was definitely a lot of thought that went into it, but like I would say, like generally from a presentation standpoint and everything, it wasn't the easiest thing to get into. But my point is, like, she said some of that stuff, which really wasn't that hard for me to know off the bat. But then, like, she starts, like, going on this fucking monologue, like, talking to herself, where she starts, like, talking to me, like, assuming I was being lazy or something, which is shit that I put up with some other people before. It's never really the case. And she starts, like, just talking in this way, like, this almost, like, very, like, snarky, proud way, like, but, like, in a way that I could tell was not really designed to be helpful. And, like, almost nothing she was saying was helpful. But the worst part is she almost, like, pushed me to start, like, you know, I had like a part of me that was like feeling that sort of shame, like, oh, should I keep following this person? This person, holy fucking shit. She was linking those like cringy YouTube videos, like how to write this, how to write a good plot, like all those like specific YouTube videos I think are just ridiculous. You know, when it comes to art and stuff, I've actually deliberately chosen to avoid all YouTube videos involving it. I found one artist that I liked who was a teacher. I got a couple art books. That's basically all I've been studying. And it's been one of the best times of my life doing it. But some of these people, it's like they tell you like tidbits of stuff that comes from like real artist sources. And then they're just like, yeah, this will work. It's like, no, that's stupid. Like, I would much rather learn well, I'm rambling a little bit here, but like my point is like, this person was saying my work was shit in ways that really were kind of exaggerated and kind of just not focusing on anything that mattered. Yet she was praising these weird like leftist furry manga, like some Blue Sky artist who was like doing crap. And the only real reason she seemed to be praising them was because they were like following her protocol in terms of like her shit advice. And like, oh, look at my storyboards, look at my digital only bullshit, you know? So they were working harder in her eyes and stuff like that is the vibe I got. But of course, none of us at all were doing anything that really had any impact. I could get into the personal things that went into, my series. And yeah, I did decide I wasn't very happy making it because, well, mostly for artistic reasons, but also because the writing, I do agree that it was a little jumbled. But I still, in the case of Total Onslaught, it's not totally slop. It's like there was particularly a lot of ideas I had for these four characters that meet up, and they were supposed to represent certain kinds of people I had known in my life. Like I remember, for example, the main character was this person, and was this person who was supposed to be someone who complains a lot and isn't very tolerant of people. And that was meant to be like a character flaw. It was meant to be obvious. And for some reason, this fucking retard, the manga artist who was criticizing my work, was telling me like, "Oh, you're just using this as an excuse to complain about those very people he's complaining about. It sounds like that." I'm like, "What are you talking about? That I don't understand how it sounds that way at all." And this person even admitted to me that she didn't even read like the first two chapters, and then she starts complaining about to me about how like some of the details weren't clear. Uh, but so, but I would say I actually got a more interesting review on my story from a friend of mine. Well, I do remember there was one friend of mine who I mean, he is a bit of an artist, but he's someone I used to talk to a lot back in my Goy Slop Discord days. But he basically reads a lot of manga, and I really, he and I had similar tastes and opinions on manga, and I really did like take his opinion more seriously on manga than it than I did on like even someone who called himself a manga artist. And I realized like when I showed him, I remember just the first worst chapter of Total Onslaught. I showed him the chapter when he was live streaming something, and I was like really nervous. He was like the one person I was like probably afraid of his judgments the most. And you know what he actually told me? He like slightly commented on the amateur artwork because that was obvious, but he knew he didn't have to comment on that part. He knew I already knew that part. But he told me that like there are some professional manga that he reads that that he's not interested in just based on the stylistic choices alone and what it's going to look like. And he told me that with my manga, it was more stylistically interesting, basically, than some other professional manga that he sees. And that really meant a lot to me. Like, he didn't even really focus on the story or anything, but, like, he really did, like, have, like, he didn't have some disappointed reaction. He did, tell me, he did make me feel like I had contributed something of value, in other words. To the point where, like, for all the screw-ups, I did feel with what I've done with manga so far that I have, done something that I don't regret, done something that did have thought that went into it. And that's much more important than feeling like you're following some sort of protocol for the sake of essentially going nowhere. It's absolutely my intention to improve. I wouldn't think that's even a question. But there's also plenty of very successful, skilled manga artists that I think are terrible in some sort of ways in terms of their choices stylistically or idealistically. And it's those things that really do matter more. And if you really care about those ideals, you will try to work towards making them professionally presentable. And that's what I think. I would say in general, while I haven't really looked for reactions much in my work so far because I haven't done much work, is that like people who are like big like anime people who are very stickler about like this is what manga is, which I find most of that to just be completely non-existent when it gets down to it. But I felt like people like that didn't like what I had done because it didn't look, like what it was supposed to. And of course, part of that is just because of my lack of skill. A lot of it is. But my point is, like, I noticed other people who weren't so concerned with that immediately, such as that friend of mine who was so into manga, because he was more well versed in the fact that so many different manga have different styles. He didn't seem to care as much about that. Another friend of mine told me the same thing, that he thought my manga was very impressive, even at the much worth, first chapter. And I guess that was because, again, different people have different ideals of, what they want out of something. And it's important, I think, more so not to necessarily, think about always being impressive, but think about, what is, perhaps the demographic or what is the exact style. But yeah, that's all I got to say. This is Riley Ross signing out. Signing all Death Warrant.